Hi, welcome to another episode of the EvilTester show, and this time we're going to consider context-driven testing, or context in testing. I don't think there's really much, there is no such thing as context-driven testing, but it's a useful phrase when thinking about our approach to testing. So in that sense, you could call your approach contextually driven. There's no such thing as context. There is a model that we create, and the context is a relationship between our model of the real world and the actual what is happening in the real world. It's models meeting other models, our models meeting other people's models, our models meeting the things that have been imposed in the real world. And context changes over time, and our being part of the context changes the context. So it's a very malleable concept, which means it's very hard to define, I think. So you have to create your own definition and approach to it. And the first thing that you will find if you do a search for context-driven testing is contextdriventesting.com, which is a very old site that was created initially by James Bach, Marick, Petichord and Cem Kaner. It has lots of blog posts, lots of discussion, and there was a certain point in time, I'm fairly sure, where people were signing up for the context-driven school manifesto or signatory list. I can't remember. It's not something I ever signed up for, because at the time that context-driven testing was being created and discussed, I used to think about testing in terms of the systems within systems, the systems associated with the business. Inside with that was a system of development. Inside that, a system of programming and testing and analysis and design and management. And then we had systems of projects and programs, and each individual would have their own system in how they would approach their work. All of that together, somehow we had to pick a context out of that. But context-driven testing seemed like a good set of words to describe it. So for the longest time, I used context-driven testing to describe an adaptive and evolving approach to testing, that we didn't come in with an imposed methodology or an imposed process and say, this is testing, we must do this, we must create test scripts, we must create test cases, we must use this tool. None of that. Everything essentially started from ground zero, applying your experience to it and modeling what was going on in the environment to try and figure out what would work there. And the reason for mentioning context-driven testing is because that is the first site that comes up when you do a search for context-driven testing. So we should really be aware of what that site says, because that's going to be everybody's first introduction to context-driven testing. And so we stress again, this is a very old site. I think the last blog post was in, so when was this updated? Scrolling through the page now, 2012. So 12 years ago, this site was updated. And the site at that point says, these four people created this, James Bach, Marick, Petichord, Cem Kaner. They have now gone their separate ways and have different definitions and approach testing differently. However, this is a marker in time for how people were describing and thinking about context-driven testing at this point in time. So if you do follow-on research, you will find more simple approaches or descriptions of this. And the reason I never signed up was the 7 principles here. Why were there only 7? And I didn't like the wording of the 7. The value of any practice depends on its context. We have to evaluate the things we do, and we decide whether they are good or not. And we do that in the context of the environment that we are in. But I don't like the wording, the value of any practice depends on its context. Because it's not necessarily the practice, it's how people do the practice. It's how the practice is viewed. It's how the results of that practice are viewed. And that might be what this is trying to tell me, but it's an oversimplification of what I think is going on. You put different people in that environment, the view of the practice might change. And that's because different people make up that context. But it's not necessarily clear from this, the relationship between the people, the practice, the results, and the entire environment. There are good practices in context, but there are no best practices. Okay, that's fine. it depends how you define in context. But the most important thing is this, there are no best practices. That's the important statement there. That's fine. People working together are the most important part of any project context. I mean, very often people don't work together. And that is an important part of the context and why the context fails. But I don't see why that is necessarily important to the testing part. Projects unfold over time in ways that are often not predictable. Yes. But what does that mean? So that means that your approach to testing must be able to handle variation in unpredictable ways, which again is a principle. Whatever you decide to put in has to be able to accommodate variation effectively, which I think is what I was trying to say, but I don't like the wording. Product is a solution. If the problem isn't solved, the product doesn't work. Doesn't matter. I'm on a project and we're doing things. So what I'm concerned about is our approaches to doing it. I do flag issues with why we're trying to do certain things, issues with the business, issues with the choices, but that's not really a thing related to testing. That's related to the entire product management and software development. Good software testing is a challenging intellectual process. Fine. Only through judgment and skill exercised cooperatively throughout the entire project are we able to do the right things at the right times to effectively test our products. It's just wording created by committee. And it's not something that I can take to heart and go, this is the principles that I use when I'm testing. And that's why I never ever really signed up for this. When I'm looking at the context, I'm trying to understand the environment. I'm trying to model it. I'm trying to understand how I impact that. I'm trying to look at what are we doing? Is what we're doing helping more than hindering? What could better look like? How can we do better? Who do we have to convince? How do we change this? Because we are part of the context. The context is not something that happens to us, and context changes, and we can change the context because this is an evolving system and process. So it's dynamic. It's not just that the projects unfold over time in ways that are often not predictable. The entire environment changes over time in ways that are not often predictable because people leave, people go on holiday, emergencies happen, we learn something new that we can try. All of that changes the context within which we work. So I just found this overly simplistic, but the concept, the overarching set of words, context-driven testing, we work with the environment. We let the environment help us decide what we're doing. We apply it to testing. Testing has interactions with all these other parts of the environment, so we have to be aware of them. What is the relationship between testing and programming, testing and the management structures, testing and the risk analysis process? All of that external awareness, we're not just focused on what we do, we're focused on how does that impact the environment we're in. So we want it to span all the systems, the people systems, the role systems, the programmers, managers, designers, analysts, the project systems, what we're actually working on, which systems, computer systems there are, because a product will often span multiple computer systems. A project may focus in on one, but is in the interaction for other computer systems. But the key thing there is there are no best practices. We do not impose methodologies or processes on the testing without thinking about, is this appropriate in this environment? Just because we've done it once before and it seemed to work then, will it work here? Context-driven testing, or a contextual approach to testing, takes into account stakeholders, processes, communication, individuals, aims, beliefs, mandates, everything. What we're trying to do is avoid ideology. And if your beliefs about something can be predicted, then you might be in the grip of an ideology. If you always say the same thing, then you might be in the grip of an ideology. You have to be able to back up your beliefs. You can't just quote someone in authority and expect it to stick and people to go along with it. And the best thing that we can have without any best practices is beliefs that open up options rather than shutting them down. So if our beliefs are evolved around experimentation, questioning, assessing risks, looking into the future to see where things are going, not just settling on what is here now, not even believing what our current model of what is here now. If we have beliefs that open things up, then we are more likely to be assessing the context and not our ideologies. One exercise we can do nowadays, because we have ChatGPT, is if we use ChatGPT to provide answers about a topic, and if we read that text and we agree with it all, and we think, yes, this is absolutely correct, we're agreeing with an average position, an assemblage of things that other people have said that are common, the most high probability things to say about this. We're not necessarily thinking of what is appropriate, and we should look at that and go, well, what situation doesn't conform to this description in ChatGPT? If we do that, we're starting to build the thought processes that help us analyze the context, rather than just going along with the average, rather than just believing what we are told. Because introducing an ideology into an environment can restrict the context, and certainly might restrict people evaluating the context. Mandates can do that. Tool X is better than Tool Y, so we're going to use Tool X. We need more automated execution at the unit level rather than the UI level. Do we? Question it. Why do we need that? Why is that better? Who is going to do that? How can we do that? Do we have the time to do that? All of those impact statements are part of that contextual evaluation. It's not just that this is better. It's, is it actually better in this context? And you've got a whole bunch of statements you could apply in there. I mean, think about it. Unit tests don't interact with anything else, except when they do. In a unit test, every interaction is mocked, except when it isn't, and we use a stub. And some teams don't like mocking things. We mock things very rarely because we like the classes to interact with each other, because it's more likely to expose problems, because we're trying to find the problems as early as possible through the unit testing, and mocks can hide that. Mocks can also prevent us refactoring the code. There are reasons not to do things, and we have to understand them, not just accept statements like page objects are bad, use screenplay patterns. Screenplay patterns are too complicated. We use page objects because they're more flexible. You could say both of those, it doesn't matter, but you have to evaluate what is currently the most appropriate for the situation that you're working on, given the resources and the skill sets and demands on what you have to do. And think ahead for where is this context moving to in the future, and create something that can evolve and change. So back in the olden days, context-driven testing was a reaction against essentially process-driven testing, where people had methodologies that would bring them in. Tool-driven testing, where you would buy a testing tool and that tool would dictate your entire testing process, regardless of the effectiveness in the environment. And then along comes agile testing, or agile development, which has many of the same principles. There's no best practice, things are in context, whatever. But there's no such thing as agile testing, because there's not really such a thing as agile, because every company interprets agile differently. Every project interprets agile differently. Every team implements agile differently. It's just a word that we apply to something. So agile testing is just a set of words that we apply to something that becomes part of the context. It's not the context, because the context is how all the people are interacting, all the tools, all the approaches, all the processes. But the word changes how people are going to respond to activities and tools you want to introduce. If you're working in an agile context and you say, what we want to introduce is this test management system, you're going to get more pushback than in other environments, because agile, that concept of flexibility, is part of the context. So it's not so much that you get agile testing, it's that hopefully the environment you're working in is evolutionary in some way and it's trying to learn, but that word is part of the context. So everything you do has to be related to that word. So context-driven testing probably fits in well there. Exploratory testing probably fits in there and well there. Automating fits in well in an agile context. Another thing to consider is capability, the context, and contextual fit, which we might look at in terms of could, should, and would. Capability comes down to, could you do something? Can you do something? Do you have the skill sets to do something? The context is, should you do this? What is the impact of doing this in our current environment. We have to take that into account. The contextual fit covers, well, would you actually do this? Will you commit to this? How will you do this? What changes do you have to make in order to do this? How do you have to change the context? Will the context adapt to this? That's an important consideration when we start imposing things or changing things, like forcing or teaching testers to code so that we can automate our systems and speed up our release processes. That's a noble aim, but we're looking at that purely in terms of the capability. We're not necessarily looking at it in terms of, well, do people want to learn this? Do we give people the time to do this? Will we absorb the impact that people are now spending time automating instead of testing? Perhaps programmers should be more involved. We've created a distinction between testers and programmers at that point, rather than everyone in the team working together, which is a much more agile way of working. So it depends. And it depends is a very important set of words for any context. But you don't just say, well, it depends. It depends if. It depends if we're prepared to accept this. It depends if this person is prepared to do this. It depends if we're going to get backing from the managers up above in order to make these changes. And that understanding is how we have modeled the context. And we may have modeled the context wrong. So when we start trying to do things differently, we might get pushback from the context because we've misanalyzed it. We didn't communicate effectively for what that context needs in order to allow us to change in our local system. Right? Because contextual fit covers, is the change happening for the right reasons? People might be trying to achieve unrealistic goals with an approach that doesn't map very well to our current capabilities or contextual demands on what we need to create for other people. So let's consider adaptation, because context isn't a fixed thing. Context will change. Projects unfold over time in ways that are not often predictable. We have to adapt. We have to approach our environment with ways that allow us to adapt and handle variation. So we need to observe what we do. We are trying to model rather than standardize. And we model to understand, not to mandate or enforce things. We investigate our inefficiencies, which are often caused by a lack of understanding or forgetting, because we don't do things every day. So sometimes we need to write down the steps about what we're doing because we do it irregularly, or we need to automate it, again, because we do it irregularly and it's complicated and we might make mistakes in doing it. So we look at our inefficiencies. We experiment to improve our model. Like, try communicating in different ways. See if it allows you to get rid of certain reports. It might not. You might get pushback. You might get shouted at. That's an experiment. And you learn about the environment. You learn about the context within which you are in, and you model it better. Let the experiment settle. Don't try and do multiple experiments at the same time. Give an experiment a chance to settle, because people might not be reading the reports. If you stop creating a report and then you go, well, no one complained the next day, you might get complaint 4 weeks from now, because that was the rhythm within which they read the reports and they need it on that basis. So maybe you don't do it every week, maybe you do it every month, but you need the experiment to settle down in order to evaluate it. And we repeat this observation, modeling, investigation, experimentation process to evolve within our environment, and other people will be doing that in the environment, and the entire context will evolve. And we have to be prepared as part of this context-driven mindset to challenge the approaches that we're using and the interpretation of the results we get. Someone might make a claim that this project was a success, and it might be perceivable as a success in some ways, but that might also obscure all the problems that happened along the way, and that might then prevent learning from those mistakes, because you might not be allowed to criticize something that is classed as a success. Then you might never learn anything and you might repeat the same mistakes. So at the very least, people with a kind of testing or context-driven testing mindset have to be prepared to challenge it. And I think that's an important part of this whole context-driven approach versus a process-driven or standardized version. If it's process-driven or standardized version, you don't really need to challenge anything because you're doing the right things already. If you're trying to evolve to the context, then you should probably assume that you're not doing the right things already and that everything can be improved and changed, and we should challenge it in order to keep that context going. And if that's not right for the context, right, because some places don't like being challenged. They don't like the assessment of risks. They don't like people changing things all the time, even if things are getting better. That's part of the context. And you may have to go slower. You may have to drop out because you can't handle it. You may have to keep it secret because no one cares. Just don't tell people. Do things the right way and do it better. Then you don't get pushback on it. Who knows? But that's part of the context, and you have to decide how you're going to communicate within that. One thing that I've noticed with systems, all systems are unique, all teams of people are unique, all ways of working are unique. So one of the interesting parts of that is that you get contextual error patterns. Not every project makes the same mistakes. Not every team of programmers and developers, people working together, make the same mistakes. But if you are on a project, look at the errors that happen on that project and generalize from them, then go and look to see if there are any other instances of that generalization within your system. Say we have an API and we consistently do not make that API robust in the face of variation. So we throw 500 server errors instead of 404s, or meaning the resource is missing, or a 400, meaning I can't really process that request. We just throw up a 500 error, which suggests that something has gone catastrophically wrong, when in fact it's an input validation issue. If we don't do that, then we have an error pattern that we're using within the project, which then might increase the risks of that contextually within our project, within the people that currently work there, within the approaches that we currently do. And that can be a useful way of finding new problems because they're really instantiations of the same error pattern. And that's a very contextual approach to looking for errors. So context-driven testing isn't just a theoretical way of changing processes. It's something that we can very deliberately do on projects to find errors. So as a follow-on, I don't want to talk too much about this because to me, the principles are not that important. What everyone says about context-driven testing, whether you're context-driven or context-aware or context something else, doesn't matter. Everyone has their own views on it. What's important is, are you adapting to the projects that you work on in the right way? And right way is a very subjective thing, because it's going to be you analysing it and other people analysing it, and that's part of the context. Everyone has models, and our perception of other people's approaches, not necessarily the reality. The context is really about models, not the actual reality. And sometimes reality conflicts with our models and we have to change them. So we better be prepared to change our views when we're on context. We better be prepared to change our approaches. So have a look at James Bach's website, because he has a post on the context-driven methodology, and he simplifies the content that was in the context-driven testing.com website. And I really like the first sentence of the rant in the middle of the page. Stop memorizing things people say are solutions, then applying them without understanding how or if they actually solve the problems you face. I would probably phrase that as, don't just keep making calls to authority and saying, well, so-and-so did this, therefore we must do it. It's very much a similar view. We have to make the decisions. There's no such thing as context. That is a model. We have models. Our models interact. Context is a relationship between our model of the real world and the real model, the real world, and other people's models of the real world and how these things interact. Context changes over time, sometimes in unexpected ways. Our being part of the project changes it. Our being part of the context changes the context. The context can change. So we have to make sure that if we are part of that change initiation, that we're doing the right experiments and the right observations to make sure it's going in the right way to benefit the context longer term. There is no one true way. We make decisions and we have to be able to justify those decisions. To me, that's what context-driven testing is all about, and that's really what, when I talk about context-driven testing, that's what I'm talking about. So if you find this useful, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the blog with the RSS feed, wherever you found this information, and I'll see you in the next one.